Welcome to Resilient. I'm Lori Lorenzo, Deloitte's Research and Insight Director for our Chief Legal Officer program, and co-host of the Chief Legal Officer track of this podcast series. We've been hearing from leaders who have set a path to a better future and demonstrated resilience. They've shared with us their mindset and how they take action to move beyond obstacles. We go deeper on all that and more in this episode with Sara Hays, Independent Director, Chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee, and member of the Audit Committee at both Draper & Kramer Incorporated and ECI U.S. Real Estate Holdings. She's also a principal at SLH Advisors and former SVP and General Counsel at Hyatt Hotels Corporation. Sara's built a successful career spanning legal to the boardroom and other leadership roles. Let's hear what Sara has to say. Hey, Sara, so glad you could join us on the podcast today. I'm really excited to talk about your story and your career path, but I really just want to start at the beginning. Will you share a little bit about your early influences, maybe why you even decided to become a lawyer or how you ended up on this path?
Absolutely. My parents were very important influence, even though neither of them shared a similar professional path with me. I am a first-generation college student in my family. I'm also adopted. I always knew I was adopted. That was never a surprise. And my brother is also adopted. And it became our bedtime story, actually, that we were chosen and that we were special. And it may have led perhaps to some arrogance along the way because I was chosen and not everyone else was. And that made me feel special, certainly. But I think it led to some confidence about the path I would be taking and about my abilities. I always was told that there was nothing I couldn't do. Despite all of the struggles and the obstacles they had in their own personal and professional lives, they were 100% supportive of me. I did excel at school. I loved going to school. I was, a gifted student, as they say, and that was something else that they really didn't have a playbook for, but were very supportive. And I didn't have lawyer role models either. I was very good at writing and loved to read and increasingly confident in my public speaking skills, all things that certainly can lead to success as a lawyer. But my family were farmers on my dad's side. I had a grandfather who was an accountant, although frankly, I don't think I even really realized what he did as I was growing up. And it wasn't until I was in high school, actually, and thinking about college, not really even knowing what colleges I might want to go to because I didn't have that in my family, that I started getting some exposure to lawyers. In particular, the gentleman who we rented our home from was a lawyer, had a local law firm in the town I grew up in. And I got a job as a high school student working after school summers, started out answering the phone, but then eventually started doing some filing in the library, doing some basic administrative support. They'd asked me, knowing that I was interested in a legal career, they'd asked me to do some simple research. Ultimately, I would prepare wills with the information that the lawyers might give me. So I got a firsthand view of what it meant to be a lawyer across a whole number of different areas, everything from estate planning to litigation to real estate transactions. This was one of those full service law firms. So that really cemented for me a path that then allowed me to see what lawyers actually did, translate that into then my thoughts on what I might want to pursue. And frankly, it was through that experience in the law firm that I even chose the college I went to, because one of the lawyers there who was mentoring me, his son went to Carleton, which is where I ended up going. And again, not really having that much direction from my folks and having all of the different college brochures on my desk that came from taking the PSAT, but not a big roadmap to follow there. It was really helpful to have a firsthand experience of someone who I knew and trusted. And that led me to Carleton, which was clearly a very formative part of my path ultimately to get to law school.
Yeah, well, let's unpack that a little bit, because I think for some high school students, working in a law firm could be boring. It could be a little too detail-oriented, perhaps not as exciting as lawyer jobs on TV might be. So what was it about the exposure, the experience that you thought was interesting or exciting, or that you found could create a path you might enjoy as a profession?
Well, certainly wanting to do something that played to my strengths, but I really felt like the research, the writing, the different things that they asked me to do were interesting, and they had a real life connection. It wasn't theoretical. The contract that I might help draft, it might even just be typing, led to someone buying a house. The will that I word processed based on some of the information that the lawyers gave me led to a document that was going to be important to someone's life. The litigation that might happen had real life consequences. And I think for me, that allowed me to connect the dots with real consequences and impact that being a lawyer can have on people's lives up close and personal.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I had a similar work experience in law school working for a legal aid, and the opposite reaction. So I did ultimately finish law school and practice, but decided against litigation because I felt like I couldn't help enough or fast enough or at the depth that many of the clients of a typical legal aid office needed. So it's so interesting to me to hear that your experience just had the almost exact opposite impression on you.
Frankly, when I was in law school and deciding what firm I might practice in, I ended up doing commercial real estate and transactional work for that very reason. I found litigation, frankly, to be a little too much about pushing paper and arguing back and forth over, years and years without necessarily having an outcome. And at least with transactional work, again, it was very tangible. You were solving people's problems, and there was an outcome that typically both parties wanted. The seller wanted to sell their property, the buyer wanted to buy, lender, wanted to invest in a community. Whatever those outcomes were, you could tangibly see those results in something actually happening. And in some cases, these were deals or properties that I would see as I was, driving, and see the impact that I was having through the work I was doing.
Those types of transactions are also more business oriented. And I know you've told me before that you've always had a business leaning in your interest in the law. And you at some point went back to school and got your MBA, right? It wasn't concurrent with your law degree. It was at some point after you had entered law practice.
Correct. So even though there was a JD MBA program at Northwestern while I attended it, I did not do my MBA at the same time. I did end up getting my MBA at Kellogg, but through their executive program while I was working at Hyatt. So that was a good, 10 years or so after I had graduated from law school, and after I had been in-house for a few years. So I practiced in private practice for a handful of years, got great experience there, kind of practiced at a great time in that as a very young associate, I was able to work with senior partners and clients, get a lot of hands-on work, frankly, benefiting from a recession that was happening in the early 90s, which meant that the ranks of more senior associates and junior partners were thinned at the firm I was at. So I worked very closely on some pretty sophisticated deals. And of course, when you're in the middle of a recession, these are deals often that have gone wrong that you have to figure out what went wrong. So I think it was a great learning experience. But it also cemented for me the desire that I wanted to be not just advising, but frankly, living with advice and being part of a team that then had to figure out how to act on it and not just sort of leave that advice on the door as I passed it over to my clients. So yeah, playing a business role was something I had always thought about. And in fact, even when I went to law school, it wasn't necessarily thinking I was always going to be an attorney practicing in a law firm. Rather, I felt like it was unlocking a language that was going to be important and would open the door into any number of different potential career paths, practicing law being one of them, whether in a firm or in a corporate setting, or going into business ultimately. As we look at my career path, that really was the direction that it ended up going over time.
I want to follow up on two things you said. One was having this other language for communicating. And I hear this so often from general counsels, chief legal officers, in-house lawyers, that in order to be successful in the role and to really develop a relationship of trust with their various business partners, they have to be fluent in the language of law and the language of business. Because it's not very often that the business partners are deeply fluent in the language of law. And so almost having what some of them would call a translator role to help with that alignment is really helpful. And so, for our listeners that are thinking about how to engage with their business clients or their in-house counsel and focusing on building those stronger relationships, I think that's a great piece of advice. And then I want to talk about your move into Hyatt, because you were in private practice by today's measure not very long before you transitioned to that in-house role. Now, did you go into Hyatt directly as the general counsel, or did you work in some other capacity and then get promoted to general counsel along the way?
So I started at Hyatt as development counsel, which meant I was the lawyer in the development arm of Hyatt. And Hyatt was a company that, frankly, I hadn't done any work for while in private practice, but it's Chicago headquartered. I live and work in Chicago. And one of my colleagues at the law firm I worked at had heard about an opening. What I learned, and again, didn't necessarily appreciate until I was at Hyatt, is there was a very strong precedent for lawyers moving into business roles. The Pritzkers themselves almost all hold law degrees. The folks like the man who hired me, who had been in a legal role but was moving into a business role, that was a very typical career path at Hyatt, which was appealing to me as well. So, coming in as development counsel, quickly within a couple of years, becoming general counsel then of the development arm once I learned the business, because I hadn't done work for Hyatt. And Hyatt is a management company, a hotel management company, but was also going into gaming, starting a timeshare company, beginning a franchise practice. And of course, the Pritzkers owned a lot of the real estate as well. So there was the ownership piece behind the brand Hyatt that really was the management company. So there was a lot to learn. And I spent those first couple of years learning the business, partnering with business people to do so, but also outside counsel who were great mentors to me to help me be successful. And also that engendered trusting relationships with those counsel as well, which I think was wise on their part. Hyatt allowed me to move into a general counsel role at a relatively young age in the development arm. And then the head of development moved into the presidency role. And that was the point he turned to me and say, listen, I would like you to come along and continue to work with me and take over the operations side of the business as well. Hadn't necessarily been the path I thought I might take there. Frankly, having gotten my MBA, my thought was that I might end up playing more of a business role on the development side. But this move to general counsel of Hyatt more broadly really did give me then a platform to engage with everyone across the company in a different way on the operating side, not just negotiating the management agreements, but having to look at, assessing risk and strategy for the company as a whole, and having a seat at the table as part of the management team.
Sounds like an exciting time. I mean, a relatively quick promotion into a leadership role, and then an immediate opportunity to leverage some of the skills you would have acquired during the MBA, right? Because it sounds like Hyatt was expanding into all these new and exciting areas. So as you think back about that time, any advice for someone in their first GC role?
So I mentioned I leaned heavily on folks that had been lawyers internally in a similar role at Hyatt. And thankfully, there were a few of those folks that had moved into business roles that I could use as mentors. I really leaned into outside counsel as well. Like many companies, Hyatt had established relationships. There was one lawyer in particular who did a lot of the development work and leaned into him quite a bit for his advice. And that really helped me several ways. One, he had a lot of credibility in the organization. He knew all of these folks. He'd been working with them for years. I was the newcomer, even though I was the employee and he wasn't. So I think it not only allowed for me to ramp up my knowledge of the business, but it also allowed me to have some credibility internally through his mentorship and sponsorship as well, even as an external party.
So I hear a big focus on strong relationships and trust.
The other thing I think that's a challenge is you typically get to that point in your career where you're being considered for that role because you've excelled at being a specialist in something. You've come up through some route. In my case, it was real estate and transactions, some corporate work as well. But now you are, in fact, a general counsel, which, as the name implies, means that you are a generalist. So you need to know what you know, but you also need to surround yourself with folks who know things that you don't know. You have to understand them, but you have to manage them so that you get the information you need to be able to do your job without becoming the specialist in all of those areas. You have to understand the issues, the risks, and build the team around it, whether it's folks that are on your staff that might be more subject matter experts in a certain area, say employment law, for example, Hyatt, that was important. We had 70,000 employees in the US alone when I was there. But I think that's part of the art of being an effective general counsel too, is playing that generalist role, drawing upon your own expertise, but really it's knowing how to think, knowing how to ask the right questions of others so that you achieve some level of expertise and competence without being the specialist in all of those areas.
Yeah, I think that transition is one of the hardest for leaders, not just legal leaders moving into a general counsel or CLO role, but leaders in any capacity going from the expert into the generalist lead role, remembering that your job is in fact generalist and building a strong team that you can rely on. I want to fast forward just a little bit. So you stayed at Hyatt a little over 10 years and then started moving more into board focused work, right? I know there was a stop at Wrightwood Capital and a GC role there for a not insignificant period of time, but eventually this moved into the board focused work. Talk to me a little bit about how you navigated the path from Hyatt forward. So
Sure.
the choice into Wrightwood and then the turn into more board oriented work.
So while I was at Hyatt, there was a move that ultimately led to Hyatt going public. Hyatt was still 100% owned by the Pritzker family during the time I worked there, but there was a strategy, a liquidity strategy that meant that going public was the likely outcome for Hyatt. And so there were a series of things that had to be done over a course of years to get there. And I was very much involved. That got me started thinking about governance in a different way. A family business as big as Hyatt was under the Pritzkers basically has family members on the board. There might be, one or two other friends that bring other expertise that are part of it, but it's very much family driven. Public company needs to have independence, needs to have, different expertise represented along the way. And so that was a move that started within Hyatt as well. I wasn't the architect of that necessarily, but I was witnessing that happening. So I started thinking about governance, both as a corporate secretary, but also, what would it be like to be a director as well? And this was a period of time where, we're still talking about not having enough women in the boardroom, but certainly 20 years ago, there were even less. And the ones that were asked to be in boardrooms were the same 5 women that, were in leadership positions in a small number of companies. So a few places, including Kellogg, began programs to get more women interested in board service, understanding what that meant, and trying to provide then connections to the folks who were recruiting for boardrooms. Kellogg had such a program. In fact, right around 2000, they formed a Center for Executive Women, had a women's director development program, and I was a participant in one of the early classes at that time. And these, today, there are far more of these, but at the time it was pretty novel. I went there to understand what my path might be, both to be, again, more effective in a corporate secretary role, but also what would it take for me to actually be considered for board service? Keep in mind, at this time, I'm 40-ish. And in fact, the Kellogg program was great, made some great connections, heard from folks recruiting for boardrooms in ways that allowed me to better understand the value proposition that they were looking for, which is different than, what you might be looking for in an executive, for example. But I came away with 2 takeaways. One, that I was just way too young. I wouldn't be considered for board work because at 40, when boards typically have folks sit until they reach retirement age, which could be in the 70s, there's no way on earth someone would want me coming in and potentially being in the boardroom for 30 some years. And at the time, there really weren't other ways that directors left the boardroom. There wasn't the same focus on performance evaluation and succession planning and making sure that you were refreshing the boardroom the way we talk about today in governance. The other takeaway was you're a lawyer, and lawyers are staff functions, and the valuable real estate around a boardroom are not given to staff functions. There's a general counsel, there's often outside general counsel, and that just isn't what people are looking for when they are trying to recruit. That was kind of an aha moment for me, because I thought, well, wait a minute. If boards are meant to be advisors, strategic advisors, and boards are tasked with thinking about strategy and risk, well, general counsels to me seem, ideally situated. They're advisors within their company. They're tasked with understanding the liability side of the equation. And if they're at the table, as I was at Hyatt, and increasingly general counsels are today, for strategy planning, I led a number of strategic initiatives. That mix of being strategic, but also understanding risks and how to manage risks, not just identify, but manage them, to me seemed like a great recipe for someone who could be successful in the boardroom, not just advising boards. But I left with those two takeaways. Interestingly, within 2 years, I had 2 bites, one of which led to my first board appointment, a company called Apogee Enterprises, which is a NASDAQ-listed public company, manufacturing company, something that I certainly had been part of. But 90% of their products and services were sold in the commercial real estate markets. So the fact that I had this real estate background that had led ultimately then to what the senior management role I had at Hyatt was appealing to them. So, yes, I was young. Yes, I was a lawyer. It turns out in that case, those weren't the negatives that I had been told they would be. In fact, the CEO of that particular company at the time had a great working relationship with his lawyer, who was a woman, his general counsel, sat on another board himself where there was a lawyer on the board, again, a woman lawyer who he thought was very effective in the boardroom. So his personal experience helped open the door for that company to be amenable to having someone as young as I was with the legal skill set. I wasn't recruited because I was a lawyer. At that point, it was because I had the commercial real estate background as well and had insights, they thought, having worked at a company like Hyatt. And then Brightwood Capital, too, which was my next move that happened right around the time I was being recruited, they felt would, again, allow me to bring information in about markets and things going on in commercial real estate that would be important for that manufacturing business.
So do you think it's fair to say, for anyone that may be listening that's interested in board service, that a little tongue-in-cheek, that lawyers are a dime a dozen, so it's not necessarily that you are a lawyer, have practiced as a lawyer, or been to law school. It's all of the wealth of experiences beyond that. So being a lawyer is a way to think about things. It's the experiences, the subject matter expertise. And so if you're thinking about board service, we probably need to think about how we market ourselves or prepare our various resumes or materials so that we can showcase all those other skills and experiences beyond just able to think like a lawyer.
Absolutely. In fact, I don't lead with being a lawyer. I'm certainly proud of being a lawyer. It informs how I approach things. It's part of my analytical toolkit. It informs, how I learn about things and translate that into action. I am able, with my story, to talk about having an MBA, having been a COO, which was something I did while at Brightwood Capital. So I entered that company as a general counsel, but with the understanding that I would be able to take on greater operational roles. That was, frankly, one of the appealing things as I left a company like Hyatt, that Brightwood offered the ability to take on these additional functional responsibilities that could, were accretive to my skill set, accretive to my story, made me more attractive. Ultimately, as a board member, certainly has informed what I'm able to contribute as a board member going forward. So I talk to lawyers all the time about the transition into a boardroom. What are the things that have made you effective as a lawyer that are important in the boardroom? And you have to think about the way you package your value proposition and get away from your title, get away from talking about the role as if you're applying for a general counsel job. They already have a general counsel.
Yeah, well, on that note, have you ever experienced or had others that are in the board world had the experience where being a lawyer on the board creates tension with the sitting general counsel? Any thoughts about that relationship?
It can be a tricky one. And I know for myself, I always made it a point to spend time with the general counsel and to, first of all, make it clear that I am not threatening their job. If anything, they can use me as a resource in the boardroom to help them accomplish some of their objectives. There may be, say, a particular risk that a company is facing that is more technical than the average person might understand. Again, your job isn't to make everyone in the boardroom a lawyer or capable of understanding it on the same level. But I know for issues like that, other board members would look to me, knowing I have a legal background, to see how I reacted, what my questions were, and they would either be comforted by the fact that I thought it was a manageable risk and that the company was doing the things they should be doing, or if I was asking for additional information or some additional things, they took note that way too. So I viewed myself as an ally to those folks. I'm not in the boardroom to be the company's lawyer. I'm not giving legal advice. I am looking to that person as well. I think it's a mistake to get defensive and be threatened by someone who brings that background. It's the general counsel who is your management team liaison on governance issues. So you need a good working relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, earlier we talked about the need for the GC to speak the language of business, to build those strong and trusted relationships with business partners. Is it the same advice for the GC to build strong and trusted relationships across the board? And we just talked about, if you're the GC and there's a GC on the board, but what about with the board in general? Are there particular skills or expectations that you think directors are looking for, or a particular communication style?
Directors, whether they're lawyers or not, are looking to the general counsel of their companies to be on top of any of the legal issues that the organization faces, to make sure that the board is appropriately briefed on those, but in a high level, 30,000 foot way, and not just present them as issues, but present them as managed risks, right? These are issues that we face, but we have processes in place to allow us to feel like we can manage whatever comes our way. And of course, increasingly, as the pace of change and disruption is so much greater with companies, I think having the confidence that there is a nimble lawyer who can communicate as appropriate, sometime urgently if need be, but is also able to manage through their own skill set, but also the resources they bring to bear the issues, so that the directors aren't unduly focused on certainly compliance issues or other things that need to happen, but can really focus on the more strategic piece, factoring risk into strategy. You can't separate the two. But the boards I sit on, where the directors have confidence in the general counsel, they are great communicators, but also don't talk too much, right? They know when to speak and what to communicate, and don't try to make everyone understand things the same way that they do. They're present. Again, boards that I'm on that function well, the general counsel is typically at the table, not speaking much necessarily, but aware of what's happening in the boardroom too, so that they can appropriately raise any concerns or provide counsel, which, at the end of the day is what you're looking to lawyers to do.
I want to switch gears just a little bit, because the name of this podcast is Resilient. And I think the whole world has gone through a period of time where resilience was very helpful, if not critical, to coming through with any level of success. From the perspective of a board member, what have you seen in corporate America that has enabled resilience in the companies that you sit on boards for, or in the executives that you have relationships with, or the lawyers in your network? Talk to me a little bit about some of the most resilient people you see or organizations and what they do.
So you're right. Resilience and the ability to pivot quickly and assimilate information quickly has probably never been more important. That's why I think having folks who bring different experiences, both because of the age they are, the types of companies or industries they've been in, the types of maybe functional expertise they bring, is important. So having the right leaders in place who don't think they know it all. They need to lead, they need to direct, but listen to the shared experiences. And in some cases, you have to acknowledge we may not have in the boardroom what we need for this particular issue. How do you get that? Is it by hiring consultants? In some cases, you realize that that's going to be an ongoing issue for a business, so you need to have that resident at the board table. For a while, everyone was saying, well, do you have to have a cyber expert on every board because of all the cyber risk issues? And for some companies, absolutely. But for other companies, you can absolutely augment through a CIO and through consultants or outside counsel. So I think stepping back and trying to figure out where your company is and figuring out what the game plan is so that you are best positioned for things that happen. Have a business continuity plan. I mean, the companies that go out of business when crises happen don't have sort of the basic framework in place to understand, well, what do we do when something goes wrong? We don't know what it is that's going to go wrong, but we need to have a playbook to address it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up cyber because I would have to agree that it's a significant issue for most companies and one the board is increasingly involved in. What are some of the other top of mind issues that you see boards taking up that maybe they hadn't in the past or hadn't quite at the level that you see now?
Talent has always been important. You can't accomplish anything without having the right talent. And I think boards historically were more focused on the compensation piece, which is important for retention and recruitment, but thinking about talent development and succession planning and all of the things that go around human capital, I think that is an area that has much more focus today than maybe it did historically. Again, it's not to say that that hasn't always been critical for business success, but I think there is a focus on it now that is deserved and important. Certainly, you hear a lot about ESG, historically, shareholder return, but this broader view of stakeholders within the company, again, customers, employees, shareholders certainly has evolved DEI initiatives and more discussion, not just in the comp committee, but at the full board. The 20 years I've served on boards, there's sort of been an evolution, right? It started out that CEOs were sort of driving what was happening in the boardroom in ways that ultimately were viewed to be potentially harmful. Enron happened. All of a sudden, all the focus is on accounting and financial reporting and the audit committee. So Sarbanes-Oxley goes into effect. Then Dodd-Frank happens and it's all about compensation and pay for performance. Then it started moving towards governance. And do we have the right people in the boardroom? Do we have diverse directors in the boardroom? Do we have a pipeline? Are we evaluating director performance and bringing in the right mix of directors at the right time? And that changes over time. So it's no longer just a retirement age that gets folks out of the boardroom. And I view some of the ESG stuff that we're talking about now as the next wave. The pace of change and disruption is such that these things are now getting sort of thrown at boards and management teams more quickly than perhaps they have in the past.
So one of the attributes of a good general counsel, chief legal officer, and I suspect a good board director is the ability and willingness to apply your voice where it's needed, right? And so sometimes this means standing your ground when you think a decision should or shouldn't be made, or a change should or shouldn't happen. And I've heard GCs say one thing that they would recommend to anyone looking at a GC role is that they keep their financial house in order so that if the time comes where you need to exit quickly because some advice or decision has been made that's contrary to what you believe should ethically be done, that you're in a position to leave and not tied. Uh, is it the same on a board? And will you talk a little bit about the what I think is the obligation to apply your voice in certain circumstances?
Sure. As a starting point, I think it's really important before you join a board to really understand the culture of the company and of the boardroom itself. And are your values aligned? Is it a culture that is healthy, productive, tone at the top? All of these things go to integrity of business leaders and of the business. That's certainly at the top of my due diligence list as I'm thinking about board opportunities, because if that's not there, you got real problems, and it's going to show up in sort of every arena. If you're confident that you have people who want to do the right thing, that makes it a lot easier to feel like you can have a discussion and have an impact. One of the most important things a board can do is to make sure they have the right leader, and that someone who is the right leader for a certain set of circumstances may not be the right leader as circumstances change. So there are CEOs who are great at growth and really can drive a company to growth, but all of a sudden growth opportunities might not be there, and you might have to deal with a different set of circumstances. They may not be ideal there for that change in circumstances. Over time, you form relationships with that CEO. So it can be difficult, I think, for boards sometimes to step back and say, we really like this person, but right now what the company needs is someone who can come in and take us in a different direction. The decision to bring in a new CEO, if it's not someone saying, hey, I'm ready for retirement, can be a very challenging one. And I've been involved with a few CEO transitions where you really have to get to the point of everyone acknowledging this isn't about people, personalities. It's about what is right for the company right now. And once you affect a transition and bring in someone with the skill set you need, it is remarkable the impact it has on the organization as well as in the boardroom. But it's difficult getting to that point, and it really does take, I think, directors who are clear about what their mission is, which is we are here to be focused on the company and what's right for the company and what's going to lead to or increase the chances that the company is going to be successful over whatever this next set of circumstances are. I've also been in situations where companies doing really well, and it's easy to get a little bit complacent and think about all the great things we're doing and lose sight of the fact that, well, there may be some things that we're not focused on that others think we should. There, certainly in public companies, there's a rise of activism. And being able to step back and almost think like an activist yourself and say, well, what is it about this company, as great as we think we're doing on certain fronts, might be perceived to be not so great, and be ready for it. And in some cases, being a lawyer is helpful in being able to talk about some of these issues and come up with game plans or contingency planning, just the risk management piece that comes along with having been a successful lawyer can be a skill that translates into being a more effective director.
So I have one more question for you, and hopefully this one will be on the fun side. I am making an assumption that while you were at Hyatt, you traveled to, I hope, many of their properties near and far. And so I have to ask, what is your favorite travel destination? Or maybe it's what was the most unique or far away? However you want to answer that question, I really want to know. Where did your travels take you?
So the irony was, when I was working at Hyatt, if I really wanted to get away, the last place I would go was a Hyatt. In fact, my husband and I would do cycling trips where we were, frankly, off the grid and staying in, small places, often in countries that didn't have Hyatts there at all. But there are very nice Hyatts, certainly. One of our favorite places was the Hyatt on the island of Kauai in Hawaii, on Poipu Beach, which is just gorgeous, and that island is luscious and lovely. I will say, though, that My most memorable Hyatts, or the ones I really liked staying at, were the ones I worked on that had interesting stories. So probably the resort that is closest to my heart was one that we developed with a Native American tribe on their reservation lands. This was a tribe that was running out of money at one point, but figured out how to, through casinos, golf, and then ultimately hotels, to not just bring some economic prosperity back to the tribe, but to offer jobs. So that people weren't leaving the tribe. And we partnered with them to develop a resort. This is in northern New Mexico. And a gorgeous resort, but with so much history and just the whole process of negotiating that and having it then turn out to be this lovely resort probably makes it one of my favorites.
Well, what a great story to end on. Sara, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for asking me to participate. I enjoyed our conversation as well.
Sara, I am so grateful for your time and insights today. Reflecting back on our conversation, I can see that your early influences and experiences cultivated confidence and instilled a growth mindset. I especially love the story about being adopted and knowing you were chosen. Your journey from in-house counsel to business and operational leadership, external counsel to board director, is impressive. I think and I hope our listeners will find your story incredibly valuable as they position themselves for new opportunities and to lead with resilience through whatever their career takes them. We covered a lot on today's episode, and if you want to know more about the Chief Legal Officer's role and many perspectives across legal leadership, visit us on Deloitte.com and search Chief Legal Officer. Want to hear from other legal leaders on this podcast? What can we bring you next? Please share your feedback. We really want to hear from you about topics and leaders of interest. Hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter to share your ideas. For more insights and to hear the stories of other iconic and resilient leaders, just go to Deloitte.com/US/resilient. Until next time, stay safe and remain resilient.